All right, David, do you want to take it off?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're here with Vivek Ramaswamy, who is an American business leader and New York Times bestselling author. He's the founder of Strive, which is an Ohio-based asset management firm that competes with BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. Before that, he founded and led a successful biotech company called Roivant Sciences, where he oversaw the development of new drugs that went on to become FDA approved. Um, Bloomberg has called him a leading anti ESG crusader, and the New Yorker dubbed him the CEO of Anti Woke Inc. He's a graduate of Harvard and Yale Law School. He is the son of two immigrants. He's married to Apurva, who is a throat surgeon, and he's the father of two sons, age 3 and 1. So, with that, Vivek, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, it's good to be on, guys. I'm looking forward to more of a conversation than just a pre-scripted speech here. But David, can you hear me pretty well?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yep.
Sweet, and Elon, it's
Sure.
good to finally meet you, man. I
Yeah. Yeah. I look forward to meeting. Yeah, person.
looking forward to this. Yeah, it's good.
I mean, that was a great intro by David, and I have to say I agree with all those everything that was articulated. And congratulations on everything you've achieved so far. And I think I think people would just like to know more, more about you, and yeah, I guess whatever you'd like to
Yeah,
say.
sounds good. We'll
Yeah.
kick this off. Most people have barely heard of me, and this presidential race is just getting warmed up. But yeah, my parents came to this country 40 years ago with almost no money, and I've gone on to found multi-billion-dollar companies. Not Elon Musk level yet, but nonetheless companies that have impacted people's lives in a positive way. And I did it while getting married, following my faith in God, and bringing two sons into this world who we raise today. And I am genuinely worried that that American dream will not exist for my two sons and their generation unless we do something about it. I think for a long
Yeah.
time we've been running from something. And the reason I entered this race, I did not expect to be running for president, but I saw a field, certainly on the Republican side, forming where I saw a lot of people who were running from something. I didn't see anybody who was running to something. And I think that's what we need
Yeah.
to
No,
do.
I think well, I think you've got a really sort of point there in that, like, I think there's actually sometimes quite uh, a pessimism about the future, and with people like, well, I think there's to some degree like, well, what should we do?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the good future? you know, um, and and obviously for those that are religious, and that's I certainly respect that. But then there's also like, just if you're not necessarily religious, or even if you are, it's like, well, okay, what's the point of existence?
Yep.
What, what should we be doing, and how would we know if it was better?
Yeah. I think that these are the questions we should be asking. And I think we live in a moment, Elon, where, like, I'm speaking to you right as a member of my generation in some ways. I'm 37. I'm the first
Okay.
millennial ever to run for US president as a Republican. And and I
Okay.
think that the thing that's going on in our generation is that we are all so starved for purpose and meaning and identity.
Yeah, I think that's
And I
true.
think we're hungering to be part of something bigger than ourselves, and yet we haven't yet identified what that is. you know,
Exactly.
so I think some of this is beyond my pay grade, right? I think some of this is for pastors to take on the revival of God, the revival of faith in something truly higher
Sure.
that is true. But I'm doing one small part of this. Okay, there's some small role
Yeah.
for the revival of national identity too, right?
Yeah.
Answer what it means to be an American. That's something that you
Sure.
ask people, my age or younger, what does it mean to be an American? You get a deer in the headlights response. Like, whoa, what was that? What did you just ask me? And I think if we fill even that vacuum of national identity with a clear answer to that question, that's what it means to be a citizen of this nation. And if it's a different nation, so be it. That nation has a clear answer to their question too. But I'm worried about this country. That fills part of that vacuum, that
Yeah.
void. And that's what I think. That's what gets me going. And I think that's part of the answer to the question.
Yeah, I think we should always like aspire to be the good guys, You know?
Hmm. Well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. I don't know. But, I mean, just like I kind of grew up watching a lot of like American movies and TVs and reading comics and whatnot, and I actually sort of the I like that there was a morality to America that I think is actually quite good. Like this notion that there is actually good, that
Hmm.
there is not. It's not just all relative. Sort of a relative morality, that there is good in the absolute, and that we should strive to be a good civilization, a good people, that where we treat each other well, and work hard, and build great new things, and that seems like what we should be trying to do, and just trying to understand more about the nature of the universe, and like our place in it, and where are we today. um, like that's why I'm like a big fan of expanding the scope and scale of humanity, of expanding consciousness, and saying that civilization is a good thing,
Hmm.
not a bad thing, and it's and really it's something we should further, um, and and ultimately be a multi-planet species, like a spacefaring civilization, and make true the things that we've seen in science fiction. Let that but let that not always be fiction.
Mm.
Um, so
And
yeah.
see, Elon, I love that because I think that you and I are in some ways on a similar mission, but going in complementary but different directions, right? I think that there is such a thing as truth. There is such a thing as the good. And
Well, we should, yes, I think if you say like this truth with acknowledged error,
mhm,
like is important. Which to say like we think this is true might be wrong. Generally speaking, I think is, but I think one can aspire to get closer to the truth. Yeah.
absolutely. And what are the conditions that allow one to aspire to truth? I think that this platform we're having this conversation on, I think you bought it at least with part of the aspiration of believing that the free exchange of
Yeah.
ideas is part of the path
Absolutely.
that leads to truth.
Definitely.
And I think each of us is different and is interested in different spheres, right? I think part of your passion, it seems, is expanding to the frontiers of the universe, beyond this Earth, exploring, being the pioneers, the explorers, even on other planets. I look at
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
it,
yeah, and to be totally clear, I for sure am a fan of like, hey, let's not mess this planet up.
fair enough,
Um,
fair enough.
so it's not like I'm like, hey, let's escape to another planet. I'm like, let's just make sure things are cool on Earth. But then like, hey, it'd be nice if like Star Trek and was real one
Yeah.
day, and or like the cool science fiction stuff,
I
and
think that'd be phenomenal. And I think that for me, my passion is all right, leaving those to again a higher pay grade than mine. But I think part of the truth we can rediscover, part of what is good is the revival of things like individual self-worth on this planet, a sense of
yeah, sure,
grounding in family, a sense of grounding in the nation. And I think that all of this too is
yeah,
even long before we get to Mars or long before we get to another frontier, as I think would be great for expanding the frontier of human achievement and exploration. There's exploration within, right? I think we're like
yeah.
the analogy sometimes uses we're like a bunch of blind bats flying around in a cave trying to figure out where
Okay.
we are, right? And that cave could be the universe, and that cave could just be a cave
Okay.
on this earth. But we send out sonar signals, and they bounce
Yeah.
back, and they say, "Hey, this is where I am because I'm blind. I can't really see where I am." And so, what are those things that bounces off of? Could be family. Could be my grounding in the fact that I'm a citizen of this nation. That is true. That means something to me. Could be my faith, that I believe in God, that,
Sure.
I'm a person of this faith. I'm an individual. I worked hard. I created something. Could be the company that I work for or that I created. That bounces back and
Yeah.
tells me this is where I am. And so I think there's a lot of that to do at home. And I just think that, our pursuits are in some ways complementary, Elon, but I think that we live in a moment where a lot of those other pillars right here at home on earth, even in the United States of America, even in central Iowa, where I am today, those pillars have disappeared. And I think part of what's
Okay.
happening is we send out these sonar signals and then nothing comes back and we're lost. And that's where I think we are. And so my mission is to
Okay.
rebuild some of those basics.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think we should definitely not lose like pride in America. Like we should be proud to be American, and I certainly am. And uh, you know, um, sometimes it feels like there's like quite a weird like anti-American self-destructive element, especially in like the elite circles within the U.S., which seems kind of crazy to me. And at some of the colleges and high schools, they like in a lot of cases they're like teaching you it's bad to be an American. I'm like, this is insane.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's like it's not true.
Well, in San Francisco, they ripped Abraham Lincoln's name off one of the high schools.
This is insane.
Really crazy, And there were
What?
other examples where George Washington's statue is getting ripped down.
Right. And I think this is just a symptom of, we say we hate America, but it's really a form of self-hatred even at the individual level,
Yeah,
right?
I
We want to
agree.
flog ourselves for success. It's the same mentality for why kids
Yeah,
in school, a kid who graduates at the top of his class in high school in most public schools in this country has to hide his achievement because achievement isn't cool. Well, America's about achievement in many ways, and so America's not
yeah,
cool. So I think it's a symptom of the loss of self-worth. And it's not an easy thing to ask how we revive that, right? I think we observe the problem, and that part's in some ways easy to do. I think what we do to build up that self confidence that we've lost, whether it's the self confidence to start a small business or the self confidence to set out to Mars, or at least the self confidence to say, I'm a citizen of the nation founded on the most admirable ideals in human history, and I'm going to be proud of that. That ain't going to be easy, but I think that is the challenge that whoever leads this country, and I'm aiming to be that person next. I think in the next 20 years, if we don't get this right, I don't think we're going to have a country of the same kind that we will be talking about American exceptionalism anymore. And I think that will be not just a loss for the United States of America, I think that will be a loss for the world because part of America's role in the world is to provide an example of what is possible when you have a country founded on those ideals. And once you start
sure.
apologizing for those ideals, I think that's going to be a permanent loss for history. And so, I have thoughts on this. Maybe you have thoughts on this too, but identifying the problem, I think we're all seeing it with clear eyes. What we do about it, I think, is going to be is a tougher question, and I have my views on it. But Elon, maybe you do too.
Yeah, yeah. Stop this nonsense immediately, and castigate the educational system for teaching kids such nonsense. Um, like what the hell's going on? And like the donors to these universities and high schools and whatnot should be like rescinding their donations and saying, "What the hell are you guys doing?"
Yeah, that's a
Um,
start. A big part of this is
stop sending
the federal government.
stop sending
Federal
yeah
government's a
stop
big
sending those,
problem too.
those
I mean, so you talk about those local
yeah
schools. What the heck are they doing? That comes from the U.S. Department of Education. So it's a little bit invisible to
yeah
a lot of people. It's not just the school boards that parents are happily now engaged in. The U.S. government says you don't get money from the federal government, which covers about 10% of public school budgets in this country, unless you adopt these toxic, self-hating, racial and gender ideologies. But it's broadly more of a national self-loathing ideology. And I think that, like
okay.
many things, this is
So
solvable.
we're basically we're paying people to hate America.
Yes, we are.
That's the thing.
Yes, we are. And I think that's
And that's
solvable. That piece of it's
utter
solvable.
madness, and it needs to stop.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like we're just punching ourselves in the face here. I suggest we stop punching ourselves in the face.
And this gets back to religion, Elon. You want to know why? Because it's like a self-flogging, right? It's like wearing a hair shirt, right? There's a
Yeah,
sort of religious practice. People, engage in. This is an interesting feature of exists in certain Christian tradition, exists in certain Hindu traditions, exists in basically every major tradition in the world. Is there's some sect that does engage in a sort form of self-flogging. And so I think what's happening here is we have a group of people in our country right now who are, again, hungry to be part of something bigger than themselves, have a hole the size
yeah,
of God
sure.
in their heart, and traditional religion or God doesn't fill it. They engage in a different kind of self-flogging instead. I believe, by the way,
Yeah,
that's much of what the climate cult internationally is all about, is a substitute for
Yeah, well,
religion of self-flogging. But I think the same goes for American self-hatred.
it's a little
It's
culture.
complicated.
I mean, I also don't completely disagree with the climate stuff.
We could go into that. You want to go into that a little bit?
I think as an individual, I might have as an individual, I think I might have done more to help with climate things than any other individual by pretty big margin. And so sometimes people will bizarrely think I'm like right wing or something. I'm like, I've been like literally pouring blood, sweat, and tears next level into saving the environment. What are you talking about? This is so insane. Um, so at least I perceive myself to be a moderate, and I aspire to be a moderate and reasonable and not to take and like just to care about our fellow humans and further civilization and I think part of it also is that the United States has been the on top for such a long time that there's a certain complacency that results when you've been winning for like the United States really has been winning for so
Yep.
long, and it's like a pro sports team that has been winning for so long. You get a little
Yep.
complacent,
Yep.
and that's I think we should be wary of that. We should not be complacent. And you start thinking like there aren't any external enemies. It's just like with ancient Rome. If Rome didn't have an external enemy, they would have civil wars.
Yes.
Um, and so, in the absence of if you just perceive yourself to be essentially invulnerable, then internal conflict is a natural consequence of that because there are no external enemies.
Well, look, I think
But,
that
but
I think.
but in reality, there sort of are, or at least there are external
Mhm.
competitors. Um, and we're obviously facing a huge transition that's happening in the world today is obviously the rise of China and the fact that the Chinese economy is probably going to be 2 to 3 times the size of the U.S. economy. This is really a big change because for as long as anyone's been alive, the United States has had the biggest economy in the world. Um, but if in the case of China, you simply said assume a GDP per capita efficiency relative to the U.S. of 70%, that would be roughly equivalent to 1 billion people in the U.S. or 3 times our current population. So the probability is like really China's going to we will be in a rather odd situation that no one actually can even remember where there is an economy twice our size.
Yeah, so
Um,
I think that's correct on the trajectories. I think there's a couple points in there, Elon, really important points that are actually encouraging for the United States, oddly enough. One was your point about the fact that our success bred our entitlement, right?
yeah,
Success,
it's
it's
inevitable.
inevitable. This is just
It,
history, right?
yeah,
Success breeds entitlement,
yes, yes.
and
It's normal. It's a human
it's a
thing.
human thing. And then entitlement breeds laziness. And then, of course,
Yeah,
victimhood culture follows because victimhood
yeah.
vindicates laziness. And you saw this in Rome, too. And so I appreciate the ancient Roman Empire analogy. Actually, my second book was all about exploring whether or not we are at the equivalent of the end of the Roman Empire.
Yeah,
And
which we should be worried
I think we
about,
should
by
be
the way.
talking about it. We should be talking about it. So
Yeah.
I had took a dark turn during that book, midway through Nation of Victims, and halfway through the book, I concluded that actually we should be so lucky as to be Rome, because Rome lasted a couple thousand years,
Yeah.
right? If you include the second half,
True.
and we
Yeah.
might be more like Carthage, which only lasted a few hundred.
Yeah.
But
Well, actually, Carthage
it
was
depends.
for quite a long time, but definitely got short circuited there by
Yes, it
Rome.
did. It did. And so I think that was one version of it. But actually, my more careful study of it was that we talk about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. It turns out
Yeah.
there were many rises and many falls, actually.
Yeah.
There
Sure.
was no one
Yeah.
rise and one fall. And I kind of see the rise of this American experiment the same way. I think there will be many rises and there will be many falls, but I don't think we're done with this ball game yet. I think we are still
Sure.
we still can be in our ascent. And so just the
Yeah.
arithmetic of it, Elon,
Yeah.
you're right. If you extrapolate the existing GDP growth rate curves and linearly play them out on a compounding rate, it's exactly what you said for China in relation to the U.S. That is a big part of the reason why leading the country as U.S. president, one of the core things I've prioritized is actually making GDP growth a metric that we actually care about in this country. And
Sure.
in some ways, I'd rather measure
Well,
economic prosperity than some other metric that we've chosen, carbon emissions or whatever the metric of the day may be. Let's actually choose the one that better tracks the prosperity and might of our country over the next 50 years. And I think it's actually going to be more achievable than we've made it out to be.
Well, I mean, we want to make sure that the United States remains very much a meritocracy. Um, that is a function of someone's skill and hard work that results in their success, and that we do not have any sort of an entrenched, um, you know, rich class, effectively. So this is very important because otherwise it results in sort of ossification of society. Um, so we want to remain really merit focused. We want to obviously, I think, try to attract the people from around the world who are also merit focused and wish to join the country, and we should make it much easier for them to join.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I
It,
actually fully agree with that.
it's
And
yeah,
that's one of the things where I think the Republican Party needs to define where we actually stand. There is an anti-legal immigration current that, you know,
which is crazy.
which I'm going to be on the debate stage in a month, and this is
Yeah,
going to be something that if anybody has any qualms with this, I think I'm going to have a real problem with that because merit-based
yeah,
immigration is one of the
super
fixes
important.
to economic growth in this country. But you know,
Yeah,
merit is the key,
I
though.
really. In fact, I think I want to say it in a way that I think people, like the general, like people, everyone can understand, which is like imagine like you're pro, like America's a pro sports team. We want to win the championship. We want to keep winning the championship. And there's some ace players on another team, and they really want to join our team. And now we can make them fight us, or we can have them join our team and just crush.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should just say, if ace players want to join our team, please do. That is the way to continue success.
Exactly.
And we should
And
welcome them and not have all these ridiculous
well, and I
obstacles.
think part of the reason you have that reaction is to play your analogy. Instead, what we have is somebody who doesn't even sign up for the team just gets to show up on the field. And that's what we have
Yeah,
now, which creates a backlash from the existing team members to say we don't want any
sure.
more. When in fact, what we should be saying is we want the best ones who come and follow the process for actually training and joining the team. And that's what I think merit based legal immigration ought to be about. But, I do think that this is achievable, right? I think that if you view it, even if you play the Roman analogy, right, just to think about this in the
Yeah,
big arc of history, if you count the eastern half, it's 2,000 years. And in
yeah,
that case, here's what I think is going on is as a nation, we're not at the end of the Roman Empire. We're really just a little young, actually, going through our
sure.
own version of adolescence, figuring out who we're going to be when we grow up. And then when you view it through that lens, Elon, it kind of takes the temperature down a little bit where, yes, we're going through this identity crisis. Yes, we're going through this national self flogging, a self loathing, the kind that most people, including me, certainly did experience a little bit when going through adolescence. But you get to the other side of it stronger, if you actually get there, to our national adulthood. And so I'd like to think that's where we are, not in decline, but in our ascent. Maybe not even at base camp yet, on our way to the
We should
mountaintop.
definitely take that attitude. I agree. That's like totally the right attitude to have. Like I hate this. I just know this defeatist
That's
BS
right.
that they're teaching
Yeah.
kids. That needs to stop. That's why I'm saying like funders should revoke funding from schools that teach this nonsense, and a lot of it is happening. Um, so that's people donors are unaware of, and they should just go, hey, go pay attention to where your money's doing, and it's doing some very foolish things, and revoke funding. If they keep teaching, kids that America is somehow evil, which is
Well,
insane.
it's donors,
Um,
Elon. It's school people, donors to schools. It's also, frankly, people who don't know this. I know you know this, but many people don't. Is their own retirement accounts are causing corporate America to adopt the same
yeah,
philosophy too, right? Voting for
yeah, I think,
equity audits
yeah,
at a corporate board is in some ways a
yeah,
manifestation of that same philosophy. And what we don't know is our
yeah.
own money is being used to do it, be it taxpayer money or 401k money. And so some of this is easily
That's
solvable.
exactly what's happening. Yes, I mean, there's a fundamental governance issue that you've highlighted here, where because I think it's roughly half the stock market are passive or index funds, meaning they're just following, an index or something. Um, and these will be at Fidelity, BlackRock, T. Rowe, all the normal sort of, retirement places.
Right.
Um, but those votes are then outsourced to usually one of two organizations,
Mm-hmm.
Institutional Shareholder Services, who I sometimes call the ISIS. Um,
It's about,
um,
it's about the right use case. I always wondered what the difference was between
corporate
ISIL
ISIS.
and ISIS. Now I know which one's ISIS. That's good. Yeah.
Yes, sometimes they behave like corporate
Yeah.
ISIS. And then there's
Yep.
Glass Lewis. Those are the two main ones. There are a few others. Um, but effectively, when half the stock market are outsourcing the voting decisions to what amount to a handful of activists or people who certainly have an agenda at Glass Lewis and ISS. You've essentially got a handful of people voting half of the public stock market.
And Elon, you were aware of my last company before running for president, or you Strive. I mean, this was my whole premise, right? Taking this on.
Okay.
So I started it. I mean, my bigger company that I founded is a biotech company. Got a bunch of medicines that are FDA approved, but this is a different adventure. Last August, and actually our mutual friend Peter was one of the backers of the company to help get it off the ground, but was an index fund provider actually, which created index
Okay.
funds, where the premise of the index funds was that you actually vote according to whatever maximizes value by providing
Yeah.
excellent products
Yeah.
and services, by literally not saying that you're going to divest from certain companies or invest in others. Many people play that game, but to say, no, it's the same passive exposure. Oh, and then by the way, there's a separate arm of it that does proxy voting on behalf of people who don't want to be stuck
Yeah.
with the duopoly. And so I believe,
Right.
all else equal, I want to see the government stay out of this as minimally as they can to solve these problems. This should be solved through the market. People gravitated to it,
Yeah.
got off the
Well,
ground pretty quickly, but it's going to
yeah.
require seeing these complicated challenges, which are different than the classical threats to liberty or culture that we saw half a century ago.
Yeah, well, I think like fundamentally here the public is being misled,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't realize they're being misled in that they've given their savings to these 401k plans and these index funds, and that's what really constitutes half the market, and they're on the assumption that that the way that those shares will be voted is in the shareholder interest that will maximize their ultimate return and have the best sort of retirement savings and that kind of thing. But actually, that is not what is occurring.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the votes are in many cases contrary to the shareholders'
Oh,
interests,
they're directly
and the public
contrary
does.
to them. So I'll give you two funny
Yeah,
examples. Is
but the public doesn't know this.
It's totally
It comes
invisible.
as a huge shock to the
It's
public.
totally
Yeah,
invisible. So I mean, this has been. I've tried my best. I wrote 2 books in the last couple of years about it, but it's their technical subjects. And the thing I've realized is it
yeah,
is designed to be technical for a reason, and that says a lot about why we see technocratic abbreviations like ESG. It sounds boring,
yeah,
CBDC, whatever it is. It's designed to sound boring for a reason. Is we want to make it difficult for people to see the way in which their own investment accounts, say, are weaponized against their own best interests. On that particular case, Elon, this is probably, I think I'm an antitrust skeptic mostly, but if you believe in
yeah,
antitrust law, this is arguably the largest antitrust violation in human history, of the same three firms being the largest shareholders of major competitors and of each other at the same time,
yeah,
using their votes in a coordinated dogma as a signatory of the same social commitments because the same pension funds are interested in them or invested in them. But the real question is,
yeah. No, I think all those like BlackRock, Fidelity, T. Rowe all need to be like, hey, look, the votes are going to be to maximize shareholder value, not for some random sort of work or other agenda that these outsourced shareholder services companies are promoting, which is that basically what I'm saying is like, T. Rowe, BlackRock, Fidelity, they're breaking the deal
that's right,
with their customers.
they are.
Okay, they're breaking the deal because the deal is and if the deal is maximize shareholder value. The deal is not go make a bunch of social changes.
That's right. And you know what they say now, of course. So I always believe in getting the best arguments for the other side on the table. So they'll say, no, you don't understand. This is maximizing value. It's about long run value rather than short run value. And we understand that more diverse
Yeah, that's
teams, of
BS.
course, it's BS. We got to cut through it. And
Yeah.
so the funniest thing is, like, take Apple, right? Your friend Tim over there is,
Sure.
so
Sure. Sure.
so Apple. So there's this proposal. This is a funny story, actually. So there's a group that puts up this proposal for a racial equity audit at Apple.
Okay.
Okay, it's like they own like
All
two
right.
shares, and it's like nonprofit group. And so Apple's board,
Yeah.
of course, rather sensibly says, "Hell no, we." Meritocracy is part of what our hiring philosophy is for our engineering talent. So no thank you to the racial equity audit. And then what happens is, though, that random proposal, guess who votes for it? BlackRock votes for it. State Street votes for it. A bunch of other financial institutions vote for it. So many
Yeah.
that it gets over 50% shareholder support. But then Apple,
Yes.
to avoid embarrassment, the board says, "Oh, no, no, just kidding, guys. This is about long run value maximization." So then now, if somebody new shows up at the table, right? So Strive, say the firm I've founded, right? The experience that we had was, you'll then show up at the very company that even 2 years before was saying hell no to this nonsense, because they've been forced to bend the knee and been chastened, and in their sense and experience of it, publicly shamed by it. Then if somebody says, no, 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 why
Hmm.
don't we just undo that very thing you didn't want to adopt? What they say is, no, 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 this is now about, they've been almost with the ardence of the converted. This is about long run
Yeah.
value maximization, perpetuating that culture of
Well.
self-flogging. And so that's where the frontier of the
Yeah.
ESG debate is right now, is behind this farce of
Well.
long runism, which is really just that. It's a farce, but we have to be able to cut through it with reality.
It's false.
Yeah.
It's false. Yeah. And obviously I'm very pro environment. It's hard to get more pro environment than me. But like we just don't like we don't want basically some sort of like bizarre like communism rebranded thing, which is like a lot of what ESG
Hmm.
is. Um, and to be inflicted upon corporate America without the knowledge of the actual shareholders, which is what's going on. And so I'm saying the public is being lied to by really they're being lied to. They're and I'm naming names here because I know, and BlackRock, Fidelity, T. Rowe, and I know you
Yep.
guys. And you need to tell your customers that you're not making the optimal decisions for shareholder value, because that's what's going on.
And this is part of what the difference was
And
between,
it's not
and,
cool.
and the US and
Um,
Europe over the last 50 years. I'm not saying this was the sole difference, but I think it was a factor, Elon, where US stocks over like a 50-year period have outperformed European stocks. And the fundamental
yeah.
model of corporate governance in the US was value maximization. The fundamental model of corporate governance in Europe was the multi-stakeholder model. I think our side
Yeah.
won. Why on earth now, to play your
Well,
basketball team analogy, would the basketball team adopt
yeah.
the strategy of the losing team to adopt that as its own if it's playing the next quarter of the game? That's exactly what we're
Yeah.
doing, which I think
Yeah,
is a
I'll
problem.
say I'll actually say one other thing about this ESG thing is that I think the big firms, the T. Rowe, BlackRock, Vanguard, all of them, they're like they're setting themselves up for the biggest class action lawsuit in the history of class action lawsuits by an order of magnitude.
Yes.
Because if they because they're not uh, they're breaking the deal with their customers, and they're not maximizing shareholder
Well,
value.
who's really setting
Uh,
themselves up for the lawsuits, Elon, is the problem is, it's not even the people who are giving them the money aren't even giving them their own money, right? Those are either pension funds, or they are intermediaries like investment advisors across the country, right? They're like the local guy that hung a shingle at Raymond James or wherever. They're the ones
yeah,
sending somebody else's money. And so BlackRock and Vanguard, their excuse is, well, we now disclose all of this stuff to clients and they're still sending us the money. Well, that client, the problem with that was not himself the owner of capital. And so actually the wave of lawsuits is first going to probably come to the BlackRocks and Vanguards and State Streets of the world. They're going to kick it upstream and say, no, 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 we disclosed it and our clients still sent the money. But their clients were themselves money managers for other people. That's what happens when you have
sure.
an industry that's so intermediated, that there's so many layers to the waterfall. That's actually ripe for corruption. But the deeper point that you mentioned is, and it has implications far beyond just the ESG question, is we're being lied to. I think you said it
Yes.
again, and I think that gets to the heart of the moment, where it's like the movie, right?
The average investor is being misled.
The average investor is
That's
being misled. Elon, let's be
yeah,
real. The average citizen is being misled by the
sure,
government in the same
absolutely,
way that the
yes,
average investor is being misled by the leaders of the woke industrial complex, or asset management firms, or whatever
yeah,
you want to call it.
exactly,
And it comes down to,
yeah,
you ever watch that movie, A Few Good Men? It's comes
yeah,
down to
sure,
the question of, the Jack Nicholson character, right? we can handle the truth, actually. And I think
Uh-huh.
that is the moment we're in as Americans. We can handle the truth of where a virus came from,
Yeah.
or whether masks work, or whether vaccines have
Yeah.
side effects, or whether a Hunter Biden laptop
Yeah.
story was real, or whether you're using
Oh
my
man.
money, right? We can
Yeah.
handle the truth. And that's the moment we
Yeah.
live in. And that's the American, I mean, that was the American Revolution, actually. Because the old world vision was that we, the people, could not handle the truth. We could not be trusted. It had to be a small group of
Hmm.
people in the back of palace halls that made the decisions for the rest of society at large. But on this side of the pond in 1776, we said that, you know what? No, we reject that. Sometimes we might get it wrong. Sometimes we might get it right. But for better or worse, we, the people, decide how we govern ourselves. That was what the
Yeah.
American Revolution was about. And
Yeah.
unlike you, Elon, I'm not a moderate. Actually, I don't like those labels. I don't use those labels. But because the
Sure.
American ideals are kind of extreme, actually, right? Free speech. I don't think you're a moderate either, but I don't view this as a partisan exercise. My whole point is the American
Sure.
ideals are themselves rather extreme ideals, right? Free speech, self governance, the fact that we, the people, can handle the truth. That's extreme for most of human history. It was done the other way for most of human history. But that extreme set of ideals, that is what unites us. That is what makes us American. That is what makes us great. That is what makes America itself. And in some ways, I think that's actually how I think we're more likely, Elon, to get to national unity in this country is actually
Okay.
not by necessarily saying we're going to, compromise at the 50-yard line, hold hands and sing kumbaya and compromise. I actually think it is by being, in some measure, uncompromising about the ideals that unite us. And yes, those are
Okay.
extreme ideals, but that's cool. That's America. That's us. And I think that's the moment we live in is do we want incremental reform, which a lot of politicians are claiming to offer, including in this race that I'm running in, a Republican primary, or in some sense, do you want the American Revolution, the ideals of the American Revolution? And
Yeah.
I stand on the side of the American Revolution, and I think that's actually our last best chance of uniting and rediscovering who we are, and we should be proud of it.
I agree.
So it's important to not fall into the trap of thinking that all these solutions are going to come from government, right? I mean, the things you're doing, working on a given day,
Yeah.
right? What you're
Well,
doing with X right now.
I mean, generally speaking, I think we want the government percentage of the economy to be smaller rather than larger, just because the government is really a corporation in the limit. Um, so sometimes people think the government is different from a corporation, but it's really just the government is a corporation in the limit. It is the most corporation, um, and it's got a monopoly on violence.
Yep.
And so you have to like say, okay, how much do you want a giant monopoly on violence to do? Um,
Yep.
you know, not that much, less, generally,
Mm-hmm.
not more. Um, and we've shown over and over again that the power of free enterprise and competition. We do need to make sure that there's good competition in these markets. Competition, makes companies honest and makes them work harder to serve their customers, which is that's what makes people happy
Mm-hmm.
and makes for a better world. Um, if you wouldn't want to have just like one car company, or
No.
one airline.
No.
Um, you want them to compete and that's what makes things better and have that across the board. So whenever something moves to the government, the important then it's like saying, okay, now we've now got rid of competition, and the feedback loop for improvement is very small, and so the same person in government or in private industry, they're going to be is far more productive in private industry. Um,
Yep.
so we just want to make sure our personnel allocation is towards that which is most productive, yields the best standard of living for the people.
And by the way, I'm totally down to take questions. I'm actually a very bad co-host of this is actually the first spaces that I have been a host of. So that's
Okay.
actually, I don't know how to take it, but if
Well,
you guys,
the
you or Sax want to
conversation,
take questions,
yeah, the
go
conversation's
for
been
it.
going so well. I've just been trying to stay out of it and let you guys talk.
Well, we had a good
So
one, Sax, on All In. I like that,
yeah,
and
that's right.
actually, we left off on Ukraine last when you and I spoke, but
Well,
I'm
speaking
happy to
of
go wherever you guys want.
yeah, and by the way, everyone should check out the last pod that we did, the All In pod, we did 2 hours with Vivek about a week and a half ago. So everyone should check that out. But speaking of truths the public can't handle, I'm seeing on Twitter, reported by Michael Tracy, and Glenn Greenwald retweeted him, that the Senate just voted down having an accountant for Ukraine. They call it an inspector general. That's
Why?
basically a fancy
Why?
term for an accountant. Exactly.
We can
Uh,
handle the truth. We can handle the truth that our money was siphoned to play a bunch of Ukrainian corrupt people, including the government bills. A lot of people, Elon, in terms of our money, not knowing how our
Yeah.
money is being used. Here's another one. People in the U.S. don't know this, but our taxpayer money is literally paying the salaries of the people who work for the Ukrainian government. And if we're going
Okay.
to do it, let's at least see it, right? Let's at least
Yeah.
be able to account for it and see the
That sounds.
dollars.
Yeah.
But
We should. I mean, should. Yeah. I mean, like I think I believe in supporting Ukraine, but we're just. Yeah. We want to know that the money is actually going to help the
so
people of
why?
Ukraine,
Why, Elon?
and
Can I ask you that?
it's not. We just want to make sure. Are we enriching a handful of oligarchs, or are we
Yep.
actually helping the people of Ukraine? And we just need to make sure we're actually helping the people of Ukraine as much as possible. I think I wouldn't even say like some impossible standard for like no corruption, because I think we have some corruption even in the U.S. So it can't be like no corruption, but let's just like say like what percentage is going to like a warlord versus the people,
Hmm.
and the people should get most of it.
Well, speaking of warlords, though, and I would love to hear your perspective, Elon, which I respect, but I haven't heard it on this issue, on why you think it's important for us to be there. You talk about the word warlords. I think the way this is going to end, and possibly like in the next 12 months, is it's not going to end well for Ukraine. All that money we poured in is much of it in the form of military equipment that's going to end up in the hand of some post Zelensky warlord. And then we
Hmm.
have exactly a repetition of exactly what we did when we armed the Mujahideen after the USSR invaded Afghanistan. We've seen this movie time and again. And I'm a little bit worried that, among other reasons why I personally do not come down on the side of the U.S. supporting Ukraine, which we can go into. As a practical matter, I think that is where we're currently on track to head. Is about 200 billion of military equipment ending up in somebody's hands who we have no idea who that really is, and we're only going to find out after the fact, like we have so many times in the last 50 years of failed interventionist strategy. But I'd
Right.
actually open-mindedly
well,
curious what your perspective is on this.
well,
Yeah.
can
Sure.
I just
Yeah.
remind everyone that Elon posted a poll on Ukraine. I think this was in September of last year. It was
Yes.
about 9 months ago, and it was
Exactly.
basically a peace proposal, which proposed peace on the following terms. It was roughly that Ukraine would remain neutral, which is to say it wouldn't join NATO or any other military alliance, and the territories of Crimea and Donbass would be decided by the right of self-determination, basically to hold free and fair elections
Yeah.
arbitrated
Internationally
by.
supervised. Internationally supervised
Exactly.
election. Yeah.
So the people of those territories would decide. And then, assuming Crimea went with Russia, because
Which
historically it
they
always
would.
has been Russian,
Yeah.
and it's 80 to 90% Russian, that
Yes. Of course
their
they would.
water rights would be secured, so they didn't die of famine or something. And
Yeah.
that was basically the peace proposal, and it was massively shouted down on Twitter, including by no less a person than Zelensky himself, who said that this was a pro-Russian proposal. And anyone proposing peace really over the last year has been pretty much shouted down and called the worst names, called an appeaser, called a Putin puppet and all sorts of things like that. When really we just wanted to figure out a amicable or a reasonable compromise to the situation. And about 60% of the people voted against the peace proposal. But now, if you look at the situation, what we're getting is not better; it's much worse.
Yes.
It,
Hmm.
It's gonna get worse from here, not better. Exactly. The reason I put that forward that proposal was for the benefit of Ukraine, not
Hmm.
for the benefit of Russia. That so it's like I want to be clear. I'm on Ukraine's side here, big time, and I've demonstrated that with actions, with the massive support that Starlink has provided, which the Ukrainian government has been acknowledged many times. Um, Frankly, it was instrumental in in the war. So
See, Elon, this is a fun one, actually, probably because the three of us have kind of complementary perspectives here. I'm on America's side on this because well, I'm running to be the U.S. president, but I'm not. I'm not sure that the cut and dry Ukraine side of this versus Russia side of this is as clean as we make it out to be, in the sense that there's a lot of history here in the Donbass region, and there's a lot of history for NATO saying that we would not expand. This is James Baker, the U.S. Secretary of State's commitment to Gorbachev in 1991, that we would not expand 1 inch. That was the famous not 1 inch commitment beyond Germany. And yet here we are now, even not only admitting more nations to NATO after the fall of the USSR than we ever did during the USSR, but now even entertaining the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, which was the one hard commitment that Putin required, or at least appeared to demand, prior to his decision to actually pull the trigger and invade Ukraine. And so I guess
Yeah.
I'd be curious, Elon, like why are you on the side of Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just make it clear that uh, when I look at a subject, I'll often get like just OCD on it and go like just to insane levels of detail to understand exactly what is going on at a precise level and minimize the error of my understanding of. And I actually read almost the entire history of the region. So starting from Oleg, uh, who seized Kiev in 1882 and essentially formed the beginning of Kievan Rus, and it goes on and on from there. And the I think it was Catherine the Great in like 1893 tried to force all of Ukraine to speak Russian. There's so much back and forth. Like the grudge list is so long that
Mm-hmm.
if it would take hours to just even summarize the grudge list. So the thing is that people in Ukraine and Russia can find a million reasons to hate the other side, if you just look at the history. So this is why the Christian principle of turn the other cheek is a very wise one, because if you do not ultimately forgive your enemy, you're stuck in a cycle of retribution forever. And so even though your enemy, they may have done really bad things, if you keep wanting to get revenge, back and back, back and forth, an eye for an eye, eventually everyone's blind. So that's why there has to be forgiveness, and there has to be some realism, and we need to also look at Ukraine and Russia not as Russia is pure devil and Ukraine is pure angel. There are no angels in war.
Mm-hmm.
Neither side. There have been terrible things done by both sides, of course. Now,
And,
on balance, I think obviously I support Ukraine, but I think there's if we have to be realistic about what's going forward, and we as we speak, the flower of Ukrainian youth is dying in trenches.
mm-hmm.
So there
Mm-hmm.
better be a damn good reason for that. It actually needs to matter. Why are these boys dying? For what?
And that's a good question we haven't ourselves answered. And to the point about forgiveness, Elon, and I thought it was actually beautifully just said about the endless list of grievances. It's very complicated and depends on where you start the plot and where you end the plot, depending on what you see. Is the U.S. So the thing that bothers the heck out of me is that I think it was in April of the first year of the war, in April of 2022, Zelensky was ready to come to the table for peace negotiations. And Boris Johnson, because he was facing his own, Partygate thing, appeared to want to deflect attention from that and shows up. And then the U.S. convinces Zelensky to fight on by saying, no, 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 we're going to arm you. And I think that was actually the real mistake, because I don't think that Putin's goal so much is to conquer Ukraine. He's not even going after Kyiv, right? He's much more focused on Kharkiv
No,
and
that's,
the Donbass region. And so I think we've made this worse, is my concern, actually, relative to the two nations just working it out amongst themselves.
yes.
And
The thing is, like, as you progress further westward, the local support for Russia drops exponentially. So obviously, for Ukrainian speakers, they're generally going to be very anti-Russian, but I think most of the Russian speakers are actually pro-Russian, and it's hard to believe that when you read American media. Um,
Yes.
So, and it's also, it's not true that all Russians are evil. This is false. We should stop, and we should, and we should, we should be also sad that there are Russian boys dying in those trenches, not just that there are Ukrainian boys, because do they want to actually be there either? Neither. Why are these young men dying because of disagreements among old men?
Mm-hmm.
Why? And there's in trench warfare where only a few miles are exchanged. At what price? How many lives per mile ultimately is
Mm-hmm.
it worth?
Mm-hmm. And I think that the reality is for the U.S. I mean, Russia has more of a national interest at stake here than the U.S. does. China is also coming to Russia's aid. That there's no version of this that is, I'm not looking at this from a view from nowhere. I'm looking at this from a U.S. view because that's the hat I wear here. As from a U.S. view, there's no way this is going to end well, and I do
No,
think
it's not.
that sort of getting to peace quickly and ending and reaching a peaceable resolution where we make, among other things, a hard commitment that NATO will not admit Ukraine to NATO is absolutely a must and an imperative. And the weirdest thing, Sachs, you and I were talking about this is the one bipartisan consensus, right? We talk about actually a time of deep national division between Republicans and Democrats in the United States. This is one where Biden and his ranks, and most of the GOP, save for me and maybe one or two, Tucker, maybe one or two other people. We're barely part of the GOP at all. Have actually a defecting view from what is otherwise the single greatest bipartisan consensus that we have in the United States, which is to pour more money into a war where we do not have an identifiable national interest at stake. And I think this one of the things about studying history, and I appreciate, Elon, that you talked about the fact that you bothered to study the history. It's a good
Yeah, well,
example for other people. Is you realize that this story doesn't end well, even if you study the recent history of the United States.
yeah. Um, so anyway, I think in the Ukraine situation, um, there needs to be a realistic peace negotiation, and the sooner the better. That is what we should be pushing from the West to do is come up with something sensible, and stop sending boys to die in the trenches.
and,
Um,
and don't and don't blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. And maybe even as part of this, it would be a good idea to get Nord Stream 1 and 2 operational again, and that
sure.
having restored economic relations between Western Europe and Russia can actually be a good thing rather than a
Yeah.
bad thing by pushing Russia into a corner with
Yeah, and
China.
I think one of the things we learned is, Vivek, you referenced the Istanbul Agreement, which Boris Johnson did basically travel to Kiev to shoot down. Those details came out subsequently, and the substance of that Istanbul Agreement was very similar to the peace proposal that Elon floated in that Twitter
Mm-hmm.
poll. Again, it was based on neutrality for Ukraine plus self determination for the people in those eastern regions of Ukraine. And so they could have had that deal. I mean, that deal was on the table, and the West rejected it because, frankly, the military industrial complex is hell bent on NATO expansion. It has been our central policy, like you mentioned, going back to the 90s when we broke our pledge to Gorbachev not to expand NATO, that NATO expansion is absolutely the policy of the U.S. and the West, and they are hell bent on this expansion, and that is why we have rejected every proposal, both before the war and after the start of the war. I mean, this was known. This is one of the biggest areas of media gaslighting, really, since COVID, is this idea that this war has nothing to do with NATO expansion. In every conversation, diplomatic conversation that we've had with the Russians, this has been the central issue for them, is that they do not want what they regard as a hostile military alliance directly on their most vulnerable border with troops, weapons, bases, biolabs, nuclear weapons, even you name it. That is completely unacceptable to them. That is a red line for them. They said it many, many times. And our own diplomats, including the current head of the CIA, Bill Burns, said it. So it's not just the Russians saying it. Our experts said for many years that our desire, our crusade really, to expand NATO right to Russia's borders would eventually result in hostilities with Russia. And that is what has brought us to this day. And we are on the brink of continually escalating this into something that could turn into World War III. So, Vivek, I do applaud you for saying explicitly that we need to stop this crusade of NATO expansion and recognize that the path to peace here is for Ukraine to be neutral. And, there are precious few presidential candidates saying it. You're saying it. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is saying it. I think you guys might be the only two
I
who
think
have
that's it.
explicitly said that.
That's
Yeah.
it. That's the whole ball game
So
right
I,
there.
I really applaud you for that. And we have to stop the gaslighting on this subject. This was known, it was said by experts for decades. And now we're pretending like NATO has nothing to do with this conflict. It really does. And you just saw that at Vilnius again. So, we need to get the truth out there that that is a major component of the root of this conflict and this war, and therefore it's going to be an essential component to the solution. And we're never going to have peace without it.
It's there's an interesting deeper line to connect because I think this relates to a separate issue here that we all three of us care about. Certainly, is free speech in this country, and it's not just that there's the free speech from the government. And I loved the Twitter files. And by the way, Elon and I have said that when I'm in the White House, or if I fortunately get there in a year and a half or whatever, we'll do the state action files, which is
Yeah.
the other side of this, which is
Sure.
anytime a government official has pressured any company, not just Twitter, any company in the last 5 years at least, we will
Yeah.
publish it, at least for the public to see.
Yeah.
But it's not just the governmental censorship; it's sort of this cultural censorship on Ukraine. When I say the things that Sachs just said, right, which is literally talking about NATO expansionism, and what are our objectives here? To expand NATO in violation of prior commitments we made. The feel that I get, right, just the the ethos of it, it feels a lot like when those of us who said it said that the virus likely originated in a lab in Wuhan
Yeah.
in mid 2020. There's something about it that it's sort of beyond the pale to accept. And I think one of the things we've learned in the last few years is, at least the muscle memory of that is useful, which is anytime you sort of feel a cultural closing of ranks around you saying something that's grounded in reason and fact, what Sachs just mentioned, grounded in history, a virus originating in a place where they do research, gain of function research on exactly that very place where a global pandemic originates. It just sort of feels right, sounds about right, but then you feel the cultural forces around you telling you that no, you got to shut up, sit down, and go back to doing as you're told. I think those are actually some of the most important questions for us to actually double and triple click on and actually get to the bottom of. And in some ways, there's many issues around the world that the U.S.
Yeah.
I think has views on, but that's part of what's drawn me to this issue even
Yeah.
more is the cultural closing of ranks on this question.
Yeah, I think there's also just there's people somewhat overestimate how much ground Russia can take if there's not without support of the local population. So in the case of Donbass and Crimea, there was significant support from the local population, so they were able to make significant progress. This is obviously not true of
Yep.
Western Ukraine. Um, and if you look at, say, the Winter War, where Stalin, who was a hard-driving personality to say the least, um, tried to invade Finland and failed. Okay. So,
Yep.
like when you have severe resistance from the local population and basically everyone's against you, the entire population is the army.
Mm-hmm.
So then you're like, oh, we've got a 300,000 person army. Well, they've got a 2 million person army because the entire population's opposed to it. You will not make progress in that situation. This notion that Russia can just steamroll in these countries is false.
That's right. Or that they would have a desire to. I mean, take Poland, who,
Yeah.
unlike the rest of NATO, actually pays for their own defense. There's no reason why Russia would have to go after Poland if we've actually reached a peace treaty that's backstopped by interests of the U.S. And so, I do think that I do think it's Zelensky. I think is betraying. I think Ukraine's long run interests based
Frankly,
on the short
I
run
to be
here.
totally frank, I think so. It's gone to his head. You know, he's been faded too many times. Like if you keep telling someone they're awesome 17 times a day, it's gone to his head. To be totally frank. Um,
Like,
so it, so we're going to stop that, and we're going to say like, look, your people are dying. As you point out, it's really not a long-term smart thing. those people, those kids are never coming back, you know.
Yeah.
So, uh, and that what are they dying for a mile of territory? Like this is insane.
Here's something funny on this is I haven't shared this story broadly before, but there's actually a weird and I think promising and encouraging alliance hiding in plain sight between those on the so-called far right and those on the so-called far left on this issue, actually. So, many people on the anti-Iraq far left, I mean, folks like Bernie Sanders, I believe I haven't heard him say as much as I would like, but I think do agree with folks like myself who otherwise disagree on a lot else. And so, actually, just a few weeks ago, I was coming out of an event, and it occurred to me I couldn't find a single Republican, and even many moderate Democrats to agree with me on this topic. And so I actually gave Bernie a call and thought we could actually, talk it out. But I think he thought it was a prank call, and so he didn't want to actually discuss it. Let's just say, to put it mildly, is the way the conversation went. But I hope I get to talk to him another time because it's actually it's actually an interesting way that we can reshuffle and redraw the boundaries. Where one positive silver lining coming out of, I think, the reaching of reason on the question of Ukraine is that we do not live in a single axis two pole political partisan divide in the United States of America. It is artificial. It is made up. And much of what we're trying to retrofit into that, right? The struggle between the managerial class and the citizen, even the questions of foreign policy about which priorities the U.S. should and should not actually risk our military equipment or our young men and women to defend. These do not track traditional Republican and Democrat boundaries. And I think that also, in the sense of taking a step back, that should actually be hopeful for us as a country. If we have the courage to actually step back and see it's not about black versus white or red versus blue, if we're able to actually have a reasoned debate in the open about what are, I think, the most difficult questions of our time. And so I am personally hopeful that is one of the side effects, so one of the net positive side effects to come out of our yet to be had open debate as a country on what actually we should do in Ukraine is that it calls the bluff on the otherwise artificial retrofitted model of right versus left, Republican versus Democrat, which I think in large measure doesn't exist. It's antiquated. And, hopefully this is one of those issues that helps us smoke that out. So, Zach, we already went through the hour. Do you want to take up questions, or do you want to? We can rock and roll and do this again another time too. I'm down to. I got another
Well, yeah,
half
let's see
hour.
if there's folks out there.
I'm good to the bottom of the hour. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, let's see. I know Richard Hanani has got a book on woke coming out. I think it's called The Origins of Woke. And Richard, do you have a question in that
Yeah,
area?
sure. Hey, David. Hey, Vivek. Both of you guys. I appreciate you guys are both giving me blurbs on the book. And hey, Elon. It's nice to it's nice to talk to you. Vivek, man, I've been so impressed with you. I mean, we've been talking, from before you ran, and when you said you were going to run, I was skeptical as someone who's knows a little bit of political science, knows a little bit about the history. Not that I didn't think you had a great personality and potentially a great message. But it's always a long shot. I mean, the president, you weren't on training wheels. You weren't starting out with something, something easy. You were going straight for the big job. And you've impressed me. I mean, the message is, the positive sort of culture war message. The idea that there's not just a culture war, but there's like some kind of excellence we could be moving towards. It's really hit with people, and I just want to say, you've really, really impressed me, and I'm glad to see what's been going on. And
Thank
as
you,
far
man.
as yeah, absolutely. And thank you also for saying, mentioning how poor Europe is relative to the U.S. I think that's a point that doesn't get made often enough. You just give people the numbers on Twitter, and they don't like it very much. But I like the fact that you just, you're putting it out there that yeah, this experiment has been tried. The big government, 50% of GDP government spending, large tax rates. Large labor regulations. Those are a problem. They've tried it and it hasn't worked. So for all our problems, I'll take the U.S. Any day. And I appreciate the Ukraine discussion. I just wanted to ask about, you've talked about the civil rights law, and you've talked about sort of the importance of getting back to merit. We've talked about like the Executive Order 11246 and the government affirmative action and government contracting. And I just wanted to know if you've sort of fleshed out these ideas to any great extent. Once you do get into office, it's not too early to start talking about these things. Sort of, what do you see as sort of the main initiatives to take on civil rights? What offices are you looking at? I mean, have you started thinking about personnel, any kind of thing like that? I just want to know how your thoughts have developed over time on this.
Yeah, well, first of all, man, your book has been instrumental in affecting my thinking and even the articles you wrote leading up to it. And I think you're able to expand the Overton window on this, right? I think you're in many ways cracking that open further on issues that were previously untouchable, like even the undesired or unintended effects of civil rights acts of 1964. I think that that's actually something that we ought to be able to talk about in the open. So
Uh-huh.
let me just tell you the simplest thing on day one, and that'll give you a sense for how I think. You referred to Executive Order 11246. Most people outside of nerdy civil rights law scholars or students like you and I won't know. It is an executive order that Lyndon Johnson signed. It didn't go through Congress. The U.S. president just sort of penned it into action that said that if you do business with the U.S. government, today that includes about 20% of the U.S. workforce, that you have to adopt quota systems for race, gender, and other metrics. Every president since Lyndon Johnson could have taken a pen and crossed it out. Actually, Nixon, a Republican president, made it worse, went in the other
Yeah.
direction as part of his battle against unions, which is, I think, an untold part of this story, too. This is a bipartisan problem. What I've said is I would take a pen and cross it out on day one. I do believe in such a thing as colorblind meritocracy in the US. I do believe in the dream that no matter who you are, or where your parents came from, or what your skin color is, you should be judged not on the color of your skin, but on the content of your character and your contributions, and rewarded accordingly. And so
Absolutely.
much of what I see is a violation of civil rights law, and we'll just like the Harvard case that came out as one tailwind, we'll use the law to make sure that we do restore colorblind meritocracy in the country.
Are
Sorry,
you
Elon.
are
Elon was saying
you
something there.
I just wanted to follow that, Vivek. I mean, what do you think about, the Civil Rights Act is sort of a sacrosanct, right? I like to frame it as civil rights law, but I understand that there's going to be difficulties here. How confident are you that you could take that message and you could sell it? Because I don't think it's going to be easy, even though I do think it's worth doing and it's doable.
Well, I'm going to sell it, and whether I succeed or not depends on the responses of people of this country. But my whole premise is I'd rather speak truth and lose the election than to win by playing some political snakes and ladders. So far, it's been working. It got me from zero to third in the polls or
Yeah,
whatever
you're
we are
you're
now.
nipping, you're nipping on DeSantis's heels, man. I've seen the polls. It's pretty
But we'll
incredible.
see. I'm not attached to a particular result. I'm attached to the truth. And my view is, look, I actually pushed. I might as well just share this with people. I pushed Trump's people on this, right? I asked them why they didn't just take a pen and cross it out, and what they said is that was a political hill they didn't want to die on. And my view is if you're grounded in principle and you're grounded in moral foundations and first principles, not vengeance or grievance or animus towards anyone, but really just grounded in first principles, then you should not have to worry about what the political fallout is. And people tend to follow leaders rather than people who are afraid of the people they're leading. And my bet is, Richard, I think we're going to be successful. I think a lot of the jurisprudence of so-called hostile work environment lawsuits, somehow non-discrimination on the basis of race or gender, became interpreted to say you can't create a hostile work environment, which means you say things that people disagree with, or else you're violating the civil rights laws. No, I don't think that's the way it was supposed to work. I say this tongue in cheek as a Hindu, but as an expression, there are no sacred cows here for me. Not when it comes to the U.S. laws, at least. I think we have to go to the heart of the matter, and I do think that there were many unintended consequences where even if the people who voted for the Civil Rights Acts then knew that they were being applied the way they are today, I think they'd be shuddering, and I think we have to at least take
Totally.
that history into account.
Exactly. Would yes. Um, we're actually violating the spirit of those who put the laws in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Insane.
there's a
Insane.
great story. I mean, in the book, I go over this a little bit about the original intent of the Civil Rights Act. I mean, they put a provision right in there. They were worried about disparate impact. They were worried, oh, what if somebody has a test and somebody does better than someone else? One race does better than the other. Is that going to be illegal? It came up because in Illinois they had a kind of a version of the Civil Rights Act, and they went after Motorola for this. And they actually put a provision into the Civil Rights Act specifically so this would not happen. The New York Times editorialized against disparate impact. Everyone thought that this was a ridiculous concept. You can look at the some of the senators who voted on the bill said things like, you could still have if whites have more education than blacks and your workforce is all whites, you could set the standard as high as you want. It doesn't matter as long as you're hiring by merit. I mean, the historical record is absolutely clear. You look at the court cases that have ruled on this; they basically ignored that historical record. They've torn it up. We've got a good Supreme Court now that's willing to move us in a better direction on these matters. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the history here is crystal clear.
In the legal specifics to one side, I mean, I try not to get too angry about this stuff because I want to just stay focused on what we're running to. It's interesting. Even America, right? The word. Not a lot of people know this. It was, it's. I was on a quest to say, does it have anything to do with merit? It sounds like it. Merit, America, and it turns out merit comes from a Latin root, and America comes from Amerigo Vespucci, who was named after his grandfather, whose name was Amalric.
Okay.
Amalric is an old Gothic word. Rick means master, and Amal means work.
Okay.
So it's like sort of the master of work. That is almost
Okay. Well,
America's heritage.
that's kind of cool.
Our namesake.
Actually, I wasn't aware of that. I actually literally own etymology.com, and I wasn't aware of that etymology. So
You own etymology.com. Yeah. Wow. Well, would you be willing to sell it, Elon? I don't know. We can.
Yeah, if somebody wants to really go hardcore on etymology, yes.
No, it's good. But anyway, it's a good reminder that that's who we are as Americans. Get ahead through hard work, colorblind meritocracy.
Yeah,
it's who we are.
100%.
Yeah.
All right, let me try. So I've just been calling on people who I recognize who have interesting, X accounts. So why don't we go to Amit next, and then we'll hear from Mario, Ian, ALX, and me.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks, David. Thanks, Elon, for doing this again. Awesome stuff. Vivek, how you been, man? Good to talk to you.
Hey, good, man.
So just one thing you mentioned on hoping that Democrats are anti-war. That ship has sailed. Don't forget that the Congressional Progressive Caucus withdrew their letter asking for diplomacy. That's how co-opted Sanders and his ilk are. But the one thing I wanted to ask you about was FTX, largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. You probably aren't surprised that its ESG score was higher than ExxonMobil. But Sam Bankman-Fried donated over $100 million to Democratic-linked causes. And yesterday, the Department of Justice announced that it was withdrawing all campaign finance-related charges against him. What will you do as president to address the weaponization of the Department of Justice to stop things like this and the fiasco that is Hunter Biden from happening ever again?
Well, I do think, Omid, that what good is an insurance policy if it doesn't pay out? It's the problem with SBF's problem is going to be he didn't buy the Cadillac plan because I think he actually committed some like ungodly sum of money he was going to give, and then he only gave a fraction of it. And so I think they're going to ultimately make sure that he gets punished for not buying the full Cadillac policy, because had he bought the full Cadillac policy, he'd already be off the hook. But for the partial policy, it paid out to let go of the campaign finance charges. Obviously cynical and only half joking here. But the real so I actually want to take this chance to go into a proposal I've made that a lot of people view as extreme. But then the more you learn about it, the less extreme it actually is. It's actually very practical, which is I think we need to shut down the FBI. Actually.
Okay.
Like take the FBI. So stay with me for a sec. Stay with me for a sec.
Okay.
And Elon, you're a reader, right? So I'm going to recommend a book to you. My wife's a faster reader than me. She's ahead of me on it. But it's called G-Man. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. It's about the history of this institution and J. Edgar Hoover and the way in which the institution was built. And it's fascinating. But
it had issues.
It had issues. It had some issues. It's still the J. Edgar Hoover building of the FBI. So it's still an institution that celebrates his legacy. But as a practical matter, right, at the local level, you have local police and you've got local prosecutors. You don't have this separate giant bureaucratic morass sitting in between.
Okay.
Well, it turns out at the federal level, you have institutions like the U.S. Marshals, which have, I think, by and large, I have no evidence to suggest this has been corrupted at all. They bust up child sex trafficking rings. They've done a lot of good work. You
Yeah.
got the DEA on the drug
Okay.
cases, financial crimes enforcement network of the Treasury. So if you take that FBI, right, there's 35,000 people who work there. 20,000 of them are in back office functions, but are really have taken on a policy making role, right? It's not like they're enforcing the law. They're kind of deciding what the policy ought to be. I'm going to send them packing, and they got to find honest work in the private sector or whatever they'd like to do, but it's not going to be working for the taxpayer. But the 15,000 people who are actually on the front lines, we'll move them to the U.S. Marshals, to the DEA, and so on. And
Okay.
then you actually have drained the lifeblood out of a bureaucracy where, to bring it back to Omid's question, where a lot of the original sin in the weaponization of government in these cases, not just today, I mean, dating back to threatening Martin Luther King with suicide, blackmailing him, it's an institution that was built when you have a redundant bureaucracy. It's almost like a law of physics.
Okay.
A redundant bureaucracy is a formula for corruption. So it's less extreme than it sounds.
Yeah, I mean, and just by the way, for the record, I've met a lot of people at the CIA and FBI, and they've all been really high integrity people. I just want to be, like I'm not saying that there aren't some bad apples in any organization, but man, I really, I've not really met a bad person.
And I think the 15,000. I mean, so when I say shut it down, that doesn't mean that everyone's a bad person.
Yeah,
It doesn't
yeah,
mean that any of them are a bad person. It's something
yeah,
about the nature of a redundant bureaucracy where, like Elon, I think one thing that's happened is specialization, right? When people are specialized, they tend to be more effective. When they become generalists, maybe less so, at least in government, I think. And
yeah.
those 15,000, if we move them to their specialized functions, I think that actually becomes a more practical way of effectuating the laws rather than the sort of
I mean,
armchair manner they
I
do
mean,
it today.
you're saying basically that all the bases are covered by other organizations, and so
Right.
we should distribute the personnel to those organizations rather than have the redundancy that exists today. But you're confident that if we did so, that there would not be gaps in important crimes that need to be dealt with.
And not only would there not be gaps, we would actually be more
That's what
effective.
you're saying. I'm just phrasing. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah, Vivek,
Okay.
I want to go back, David, if you don't mind, I'll ask my question. And good to see you again.
Go for it.
Good to see you again, Vivek. Appreciate the invite. You said something when we were talking about the Ukraine war about the U.S. made the war worse, and we've had discussions in previous spaces about the establishment or the military-industrial complex. I'm relatively naive, less naive after what I saw happen in Ukraine. But if you do become president, is there anything you can do? Because it does seem systemic to me. And how big of a risk is it when it comes to the tensions with China, which we've been pretty concerned about?
Yeah, so look, I think that the managerial class at the Pentagon, it's time to go. I think that this is a antiquated group where, kind of like the analogy we just had about the FBI. Most people, I haven't met somebody who has served or serves currently in the U.S. military that isn't in it, whose heart is in it for the right reasons.
Yeah, same.
But I think that's just the truth,
yeah.
right? Any of us, 1.3 million of them.
Yeah.
But there's the managerial class at the Pentagon where they haven't offered a clear statement of mission and purpose. And so when you have a vacuum of mission and purpose, right? I think the purpose of the U.S. military should be to deter wars and win wars in order of priority, deter wars being most important and then win them when we get into them. And most importantly, prioritize protecting the lives of Americans on American soil. With that clear mission statement, we could measure up what we have done in Iraq or now in Ukraine, which I think is destined to be an Iraq or a Vietnam all over again if we keep going in the current direction. That's part of what we need is a restoration of purpose. And so it's not that these are bad people as individuals, but when an institution continues to exist without a purpose, then the institution finds new things to do that outlive its purpose, and that itself creates a form of corruption that maybe no one individual is actually responsible for, but was just a feature of the beast itself. And so one of the things I would say is that's a tiny fraction of the people who serve in the U.S. military that actually work in the Pentagon. But I'm going to, largely be cleaning house there and bringing in, a new form of talent, really flushing the toilet on the neocon sort of dogma that I think pervades much of the Pentagon today, and to come back to, let's just say, get some Cold War realists in there, the George Kennans, the James Bakers. That doesn't really exist in today's foreign policy establishment or military establishment. And those would be the kinds of talents. And by the way, we are working on identifying the kinds of talents we're going to staff the top layers of every part of the federal government with. But that would give you a flavor of the kinds of people I would put as a new sort of leadership at the Pentagon. And the job of the commander in chief, that'd be my job if I'm elected, is to offer a clear statement of mission and purpose of what the U.S. military is even supposed to be concerned about, which for me is protecting American lives, foremost on American soil, deter wars, and when necessary, win wars. And that's it. And whether you care about what we're doing in Ukraine or the rise of wokeism in the military, these are symptoms of that deeper loss of purpose, in my view.
Yeah.
Hear, hear.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think one of Trump's biggest mistakes was hiring all these neocons. I don't really get it because his instincts were to keep us out of wars. In fact, he did keep us out of wars, new wars. And, I think he had more realist and non-interventionist instincts, but yet he appointed all these people like Bolton and Pompeo and on, who want to get us involved in all these, new conflicts. Maybe there wasn't, maybe the foreign policy establishment is just so rife with groupthink, sort of neocon groupthink, that he didn't have enough talent to choose from. But I don't know.
I think that's part of the problem, David, actually, because looking at this now, I mean, we're already beginning. It's also one of Trump's mistakes was transition planning began way too late. So I've got a guy in charge who's already putting together our plans for what the staffing would look like. And this is one area where the bench is light. I mean, Baker and Kennan, I mean, these guys are dead, right? And so.
Yeah, exactly. Well, but those are the right types of people. I mean, George Kennan was a genius. He was the architect of our Cold War containment policy. He also was against us getting involved in the Vietnam War. He said so in advance. He testified before Congress. And in the late 90s, one of the last interviews he did, he talked about what a huge mistake we were making with NATO expansion, that it was going to undo his life's work, that we had won the Cold War. We had a peaceful situation with the Russians, but bringing NATO up to its border was going to result in new antagonism, and it was going to unwind everything. And he used the word tragic mistake. So he kind of foresaw everything, for decades. And, James Baker similarly was very competent. It does seem like we have a dearth of those highly competent diplomatic figures who know how to negotiate peaceful arrangements. It just seems like the people we have now just rattle the saber and, are crusaders looking for new wars to get us into.
Maybe we need some venture capitalists in there who actually understand how to do deals. Yeah.
I think also just like the public doesn't appreciate fully that the U.S. State Department is quite belligerent. It's really like
yes.
Well, they just promoted Victoria Nuland to number 2 after.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Who is literally responsible for much of what's going on in Ukraine today, right?
She's the
head of the snake.
Situation.
She's the head of the snake on this. Absolutely.
I mean, she's a total warmonger. So, yeah, I mean, it's insane. The State Department is supposed to be the place of the diplomats, not the warmongers. But we're actually in this ironic situation where the warriors want peace, the Pentagon wants peace, and the diplomats want war. Which, by the way, also happened in Doctor Strangelove. And we just need to tell our damn State Department to stop this bullshit. And because they're not informing the public, they're like taking actions on behalf of the American public, but I don't think the public's aware of this. So
we're going to make them aware. This is the answer. It's the only solution.
Yeah, it's like we're interfering in all these other countries, and and putting a lot of sort of U.S. resources against it, and I think also creating a lot of resentment against America.
Yes.
So because if there's some, if we're like a sort of a giant, we're like somewhat of an ogre, economically. And so it's easy for us to accidentally step on, or or bump into small countries, not really realize it.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we're like doing bad things, and people are dying, and we're generating bad blood, and this is all happening without the knowledge of the public.
Yeah, just waddling in, sloppily waddling in, and then making a mess in a clumsy way. Now, I think
Yeah, and not even succeeding. That's what, like
and not even succeeding. Yeah, it's one thing if you were good at it.
Yeah, it's like
Even still,
failing.
I'd be against it, but it'd be one thing if you were good at it. At least there would be a tougher argument. And yet
yes,
here we are.
I'm like, how has regime change gone? Let's see. Let's see. Well, Cuba, Fidel Castro outlived all American presidents
Right.
that tried to assassinate him.
Which, by the way, let's say the quiet part out loud. I do think that is the latent impetus in Russia here. I mean, when you sort of get to the heart of the intuition, right? What are we actually solving for? It's we don't. It's a bit of bad words like ESG. They don't say ESG anymore. They make up some new words for it. It's like we don't say regime change anymore, but functionally, that's what we're playing for in Russia, and we will not stop until we're done. And I think it's a shame, and it's a lesson we haven't learned.
It's very foolish because anyone who is going to take out Putin is not going to be some peacenik. They're even more hardcore than Putin because they killed him. Okay,
that's right. That's right. And either way, I mean, does that mean I trust Putin? No, I do not trust Putin, but I trust him to follow his self-interest, and he can trust us to follow ours. Which is why I also want us to abandon this thing where we selectively invoke the fact that we're somehow protecting democracy around the world, when in fact, if I'm in the position to lead, here's what I'm going to say is my job, and I'll say it internally, but I'll say it externally too, is I'm in this to advance America's interests. And so now you can trust me because that's how I'm going to make my decisions. Sure. And I expect that you are going to advance Russia's interests or you are going to advance Poland's interests. And then we can all have a deal, whatever that deal may be, to be able to make sure each person gets something out of the trade. That's how good deals work. Everyone has to emerge with something they didn't have going in. And we can be more honest about it rather than dousing it in this moral veneer, which is otherwise so hypocritical that we immediately get called out on it because it was obviously false in the first place.
Well, how about an executive order that prohibits the U.S. from being involved in regime change operations? Period. End of story. I mean, this whole conflict in Ukraine basically started in 2014 with a coup, the Maidan coup against the democratically elected leader of the country with the backing of the United States. Now, the extent of our backing is in dispute and people debate it, but I don't think there's any question that the U.S. did back it, and our involvement at a minimum taints it. If it was a legitimate expression of the will of the people of Ukraine, we should have just let it happen without our involvement whatsoever.
Well, there's no question about it. I mean, they were kind about that, David. There's no question about it. Listen to the leaked tapes of Nuland, right? Those were the very person we were just talking about a moment ago in our role in picking Ukraine's next leader. She didn't know those were, being taped calls, but now we understand that we were absolutely driving that. So, all that said, I can be cheerful about this if we learn the lesson and we behave differently going forward as a consequence. But I do not think suppressing the information and tricking the public to fail to learn that lesson is going to be the right answer for us.
No, exactly. And I can think so on the Ukraine front, our larger concern should just be when all said and done, where are the boundaries going to be and how many people died. And I think we should just think hard about that and not sacrifice the flower of Ukrainian not sacrifice the flower of Ukrainian youth in trenches to achieve nothing, which is currently what we're pushing them to do, and that's insane. So that needs to stop.
Yeah. I'm into it. Sax, you want to take one or two more? I'm having too much fun, but I can take a couple more. I'm having too much fun, but unfortunately I gotta, I could talk to you guys all day, but got to roll pretty soon.
All right. ALX, you have a question?
Yeah. So you mentioned that if you became president, that you would release like a similar style Twitter files or Facebook files type thing, but you do it for all companies that the government has interacted with and sort of tried to pressure. How would that look like?
Yeah, so basically, a lot of what I think is happening today is the government is deputizing private companies to do through the back door what the government couldn't directly do through the front door, right? So Elon releasing the Twitter files confirmed what I, on the page of the Wall Street Journal a couple years ago surmised and everyone dismissed as a conspiracy theory that absolutely this was happening and at a scale unimaginable with social media companies. You responding to government threats and in some cases inducements, carrots and sticks, to censor speech that the government could not censor directly. I mean, even down to individuals like by name, Alex Berenson. Why didn't you shut down his Twitter account? This individual in a meeting in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's just this is if the First Amendment was created to do one thing, like literally, there's just one thing the First Amendment exists for. It is to protect people to be able to criticize the government and its policies. That's what this guy's high crime was, is he criticized government policies on COVID-19. And then the government is saying, no, this guy needs to be shut down. How could you possibly? And with an implicit threat of regulation over Twitter if Twitter didn't follow through. And so the pre-Elon Twitter, managerial class did indeed follow through on the threat. And then they get an attaboy on the back from the government. So that's one example. But it's not just limited to social media. I think this is pervasive across the U.S. economy, actually. I think it's much of what's going on, say, with John Kerry in his role as the climate czar. He's somebody who they could not pass the Green New Deal through Congress. And so he has boasted about meeting with the banking CEOs of this country, the CEOs of most major banks, getting them to sign a pledge, a sort of climate pledge to join a North American net zero alliance. I'll remind you that banks are not charitable institutions, right? This is a two-way relationship. So what are they getting in return for signing that pledge? Again, it's a backdoor way of getting done what the politically accountable class, people we elect in Congress, would have never been able to do through the front door. Even Joe Manchin would not have stood by and let them do it. And so what I've said is that if you're a federal employee, so I'm a state action doctrine guy, which is if it's state action in disguise, then I think the Constitution still applies, which means that the government can't use a puppet in the private sector to get done its dirty work. It's bound by the same constraints as the federal government, so we should know about it. So what I would say is that on pain of criminal penalties, any evidence of documented evidence of a government employee who has pressured a private actor to achieve a goal that the government couldn't have achieved itself, we just have a sunshine law applied to it. Let the public see it. Roll that log over. Let's see what crawls out. And that's it for that particular provision, right? I mean, I have a lot of different views on rescinding a lot of unconstitutional federal regulations and reorganizing the federal government. But on this one, it's that simple. And I think that the first step of restoring truth, back to that principle, we can handle the truth. Just tell us. Tell us what the truth is. We can deal with it. We can process it. We can handle it, but let's at least see how deep that rot runs. And the fact that I'm sitting here as a private citizen observing small examples of it bubbling up to the surface, it's like a broken windows theory, which is to say if you see a broken window, it means that there's something else wrong in the neighborhood. That's what I think is going on. And so hopefully that addresses your question. That's doable. It's easy. It's what you would expect and hope for of a chief executive who's in charge of the executive branch of the government. And that's an easy thing to at least be able to deliver on to help rebuild public trust, which is, I think, something we've been badly lacking. And so whether it's UFOs, whether it's the Jeffrey Epstein client lists, whether it is the effectiveness of vaccines, whether it's what we just talked about, my view is we can handle the truth, trust the public with it, and then that's going to actually, ironically, rebuild trust in institutions that the public has otherwise now long correctly lost.
Hey, Vivek.
It's awesome. Thank you.
Given the problems with the
Appreciate
last
it, man.
election cycle, we had the election infrastructure problems, obviously.
Take one last one, David, and then we'll wrap.
Can Vivek hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to go to ask
Hello?
a question. If
Well,
you
we
don't
have
mind.
Ian and Nuance,
Yeah.
bro. How about
Maybe we'll take them together.
Can we,
We'll
can
take
we,
them
can the
together.
American
Yeah,
go
we'll
first?
take them together.
Is that possible?
Oh, come on.
That's awesome.
Nuance. Relax.
So Vivek, obviously there were problems with election infrastructure during the last election cycle, but I think one of the
Nuance? Ian?
I don't think
Nuance, you
I
go
don't
first,
think,
and then Ian?
Vivek
That's
I don't
it,
think
David.
you can hear Nuance,
Yeah.
so I'll just
yeah, I
ask
don't
my
think
question.
Vivek can hear me.
So, Yeah. So hey, Elon, David, Vivek, great conversation. Thanks for having me up. I think the audience is really enjoying this whole back and forth. I feel it's a real breath of fresh air to have such an open conversation on X Spaces. So my question for you, and this ties back to one of our conversations that we had on Mario's Space, right? You mentioned that if you were elected, you'd want for American businesses to be banned from doing business in China. Now you didn't really elaborate on that, and so my question is, how that work for companies like Apple or even Tesla, which operate over there? In my opinion, it makes sense for large American companies to hit the world's largest market. But crucially, can you clarify your policy on American businesses in China? How would you deal with that?
Sure. And I want
Thank
to
you.
actually I want to be clear. I actually think that the best state of the world would be everybody playing by the same set of rules in an economy where, just like I think we're going to be, Western Europe and Russia are going to be better off by opening economic relations through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That's what I want to see here as well. But we've got to make sure that everybody's actually playing by the same set of rules. And to me, it's very important that no more forced IP transfers, no more forced data transfers, no more forced, effectively service of non-economic nature, turning companies into lobbying pawns, effectively having a nice little condition to be able to get a domestic license to do business if you're BlackRock selling mutual funds in China, to make sure that you don't apply the same standards to Chinese companies as you apply to American ones. That's what I basically stand for, is level playing field. That's what we need. And I think that doesn't exist. I think that most people acknowledge that. I think that that's not going to happen automatically. That's going to require, by the way, a policy that I think is also really important that goes straight along with it, is re-entering the Pacific trade relationships around the rest of the rim of the Pacific, the CPTPP. I think we should re-enter it. I think this is a little bit different than what the course of action taken by Trump in exiting the TPP. I think that was actually a
Maybe
poor
one that
decision.
makes more sense for the people over here, right? Because I think Trump canceled it because, first of all, it wasn't fair to Americans, right? It really
Yep,
wasn't. But also, it wasn't fair
exactly.
to people over here. It was beneficial to corporations, but not to the local farmers, your mom and pop stores who
And
would have completely been obliterated by the TPP. So maybe a fair version of that would make a lot more
exactly.
sense.
And I think that I'm a silver lining guy. I think that I can use the leverage of the fact that we did exit it to be able to say, all right, here's what we need done differently in a number of the countries from Japan on down, to be able to say, here's how we re-enter that on fairer terms. And so that's what I'd like to see. And I think that's one of the things early on, actually, even in relation, forgetting about where we get to on China, the first thing that's easiest to do is actually to re-enter the rest of that Pacific trade relationship, including the other members of the CPTPP. That puts us in then a strong position from a trade perspective to then take a look at where we stand vis-a-vis China. So I could go on for hours on this one, and we could, but we'll take one last
That
question
sounds like a
from the other guy, and
conversation
then
we
we'll
should
wrap.
have. Yeah, I'd love
Yes,
to
Yeah.
grill you on China, because you mentioned once that you were
I
banned
appreciate it,
from
man.
China, and that's a concern of mine because I criticize them quite a bit, and I'm always worried about, traveling through Hong Kong. I mean, have they given you a reason for
Hey,
why they banned you?
Hey,
but just in the interest of time, I just want to make sure we can get to the last question here. I know
Oh yeah,
Oscar's been waiting for
yeah.
a
No, that
while,
was my last question. That was literally my last
yeah.
Cool,
question. Yeah.
awesome.
Okay, appreciate
Vivek,
it.
you can hear me now, right?
yes,
Awesome, cool,
how you doing, man?
awesome. So election infrastructure was obviously like a big issue in the last election cycle, but I think even more so is election just funding for candidates, right? So the left was outraising the right pretty significantly in a lot of races. What do you plan to do in the upcoming election, both in the primary and the general, if you are nominated? So you can outraise people like Soros, who in the last election cycle, I mean, 170 million, he was the top person out of any individual, and then including on top of the 170 million, 140 million and other things, another 60 million. His not even getting into open society foundations that did about $1 billion during that time. Do you think the richest man in the world should get involved to maybe take over Soros in that position? I don't know if Elon has any thoughts about that, but what are your thoughts on that? How are you going to beat the left at their own game?
Well, I
So
would.
that's
Oh, sorry.
I'm not going to speak on behalf of Elon. Elon, you want to go first?
Well, sure. And I think this is an important discussion. And Vivek, I think you're winning over a lot of people, I should say, I think, with your position. Because I think, what I've heard you say makes a ton of sense. I think you're winning over a lot of people, actually, in this conversation.
Thank you.
So, you know, yeah. So, my apologies. I actually lost track of.
No, I mean, he was just asking about the influence of money in politics,
Oh yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
you
Oh,
know,
basically, is the sort of there are a bunch of things which have these misnomers of like that sound like they're pro democracy, but they're actually basically ballot harvesting. And there is like this crazy, this sort of hack that I mean, George Soros is really like an incredibly talented arbitrager, and he's that applied that talent monetarily and politically, and so he figured out that through charitable organizations you can promote causes with pre-tax money, and that doesn't count in any of the political stuff. So it's actually extremely effective. You don't actually attack the candidate; you just attack the positions that they hold, and then you sort of hire a big team to go and like harvest ballots from like nursing homes and all that sort of stuff. These are real things that have happened. Um, and so there's what like I don't think we should like you know counter corruption with corruption, but
mhm.
but I think we do need to there does need to be like a get out the vote campaign and you know uh yeah
Yeah. I mean,
certainly Republicans need to work harder at winning over voters, and especially in the key sort of Senate races and House races and presidency. But it's you know yeah
and I appreciate you saying that, Elon. And for me, the real distinction isn't even between Republicans and Democrats. If we're pro-American, we stand for the principles this nation was founded on. The way I look at it is we're on the same team. And for me in this journey, this is, I think, part of why I came into this as an outsider. I think it will take some measure of people who didn't grow up in professional politics to change that game. This country has blessed me with much, right? And so I've lived, like so many of you on this call, lived the full American dream. And I have, so far, before I wanted to ask anybody else to invest money in this campaign, wanted to invest my own first. And so I've put in over $15 million of my hard earned money already, precisely because I did not want to take a tin can asking a bunch of other people for permission to run. And then that does come with expectations. And the funny thing is, even in the Democrat Party, many people on a principled basis used to say, keep mega money out of politics. You don't hear that anymore. And that does come with certain ties and expectations that I do think corrupt the way our democratic process works. That being said,
yeah
a guy like me, if I want to succeed, has to be able to compete. There's an old
well
saying
yeah
in tennis, you either win or you leave blood on the court. And I don't want to leave blood on the court. I want to win. And if you guys, I think I mean, this is just a little bit self-interested plug, to be honest with you, but just to be totally transparent as well. Other candidates have mega super PACs that have ads on television. We're a third in the Republican primary. We haven't bought TV ads, but it's going to be whoever wins this election. It's going to be about $2 billion that gets spent in order to do it.
But
And
Vivek,
so
that was my question. So
that's sort of the
how are you
gist.
how
Yep.
are you going to do it? That was basically my question.
So I hope we do it, but here's how I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it by turning into somebody's puppet. I'd rather lose this election than to bow down to, I think, a lot of the special interests that have broken the system. That being said, here's how we're doing it so far. We got 70,000 small dollar donors in the first few months of this campaign. I'm literally an outside. I've never had a donor or donor list in my life. And 40,000 was the threshold for reaching the first Republican debate by August. Sitting in early July, we're at 70,000. And so 40% of them are first time ever donors to the Republican Party. Normally, that number is 2%, actually. And so, get a lot of business minded folks on this call. I'll give you kind of a metric. You want to know how to predict an election. I'm going to give you the best metric to predict an election result. And Trump proved it in 2015. It's not the current polls, right? I mean, people look at the polls, and I'm grateful in the recent versions of them. I'm doing okay. I'm doing well. But that's not what matters. Look at how much dollars are being spent per unit in the polls. So for every percentage point in the polls, look at how many ad dollars are being spent for that percentage point. for most candidates in the 2015 election, Jeb Bush, yeah, you want to talk about Scott Walker, Chris Christie back then, millions of dollars per percentage point in the polls. For Donald Trump back then, it was thousands, 3 orders of magnitude lower. And in this race, we're seeing the same thing. There's the other candidates in the Republican field, millions of dollars in ad buys per percentage point in the polls. In my case right now is literally in the thousands. And so what do we say there? The message is lifting us up. Now the bet is we hope that if you build it, they will come. But that's where I need people. And so the maximum anybody else can give to the campaign directly is $6,600. And if somebody wants to go to Vivek2024.com right now and do it, we would appreciate it. But there's all kinds of, I mean, there's the game is so complicated. There's all kinds of other organizations that spend money supporting candidates. And my model is, we will build it, which is to say, deliver a clear message that is honest, that is transparent, that trusts the public, believes the public can handle the truth, that wants to restore the 1776 principles that made this country great without apologizing for it, do it earnestly, do it sincerely, and bet that the system works as it's supposed to. And at least gratefully, I'm able to put in, I don't have billions of dollars to put in, but short of that, what I do have will stop at nothing, which gives us a good advantage to start. But it's going to take a lot of really everybody, whether it's a dollar or whether it's people putting in massive amounts of money to actually lift this across the finish line. And so I'm hoping for a chance to introduce myself to the country on the debate stage starting in a few weeks. I think that's going to be critical in this race. I'm going to continue to use, frankly, forums like this one. I mean, this is great. Think about it. There's no separate media intermediating our messages, right?
Exactly.
There's nothing pre-filtered. A guy like me couldn't compete, Elon, if it weren't for modern media like this. And so here's to hoping that changes the game.
Yeah, no, I mean it says something like you can actually you're quick on your feet and you can handle a rapid fire conversation on difficult subjects. It's that, I mean that's couldn't be said for everyone. And you actually speak you speak with conviction and you're not just playing the same old political tapes and and the tropes that everyone's heard a million times and are obviously unconvincing. So I think that actually this is, I certainly have a high opinion of you after this conversation, and I suspect a lot of other people do too.
I appreciate that, man. And I think I'll just say this in closing because I hope it's good for our country. And you and I or anybody else on this call, we're not going to agree on 100% of things, and that's okay, right?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
And that, you and I will. I mean, me and Sachs don't agree on 100% of things, and you and Sachs don't agree on 100% of things, and so for every other combination of people on this call. But if let's say you agree with me most of the time, but you at least know I'm telling you what I believe 100% of the time. That's the best you can ask of an elected leader, and I'll at least give you that, and that's going to be hopefully something that attracts enough support, yes, to allow me to serve as the next president of this country and lead a national revival. Leaving office in January 2033, my kids will be in high school. Maybe we'll move on to maybe we'll be going to Mars by then. But in the meantime, we'll see if we can revive this country, and I'm optimistic that we can.
Well, it's rare to meet a politician that's not an NPC, and so I would. Please take that as a high compliment.
I appreciate it, brother. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you both for being so generous with your time. We almost went for 2 hours here. I think it was only scheduled to be an hour, and we just, time went flying by. So thank you, Elon. Thank you, Vivek. And thanks, everyone, for joining. See you next.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, David.
Bye. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.